effective teaching on this pleasant evening. India is one among the countries that has the highest number of educational institutions in the world and consequently the highest number of teachers and faculty members. There is a need for well-trained faculty members who will help improve programs to produce quality graduates. With the aim of equipping faculty members with required skills and knowledge, we designed this faculty development program as our primary objective. Anyone who wishes to become a good academic writer should endeavor before he or she allows himself or herself to be tempted by the more showy qualities to be direct, simple, brief, vigorous, and lucid. Our today's resource person, Dr. Soumya Sharma, makes us to know the techniques of writing through her topic, effective writing techniques for academic publishing. I take privilege to introduce Dr. Soumya Sharma to all of you. Dr. Soumya Sharma is Assistant Professor Linguistics at the English and Foreign Language University, Lucknow campus, India. She was a guest faculty at the Indian Institute of Technology, Kanpur, for a year, where she taught a course on composition and communication skills. Her research interests include examining the discourse, psychology interface, particularly gender issues, vocabulary teaching, and critical pedagogy. She has published in the areas of English language teaching, stylistics, and critical discourse analysis. Some of her recent publications include Discourse and Psychology, an Introduction, published in 2020, Language, Gender, and Ideology, Constructions of Femininity for Marriage, published in 2018, and Common Errors in Everyday English, published in 2017. Now, Dr. Soumya Sharma will speak on effective writing techniques for academic publishing. Welcome, Dr. Soumya Sharma, for today's session.
Thank you.
Now I request Dr. Soumya to give her inputs on effective writing techniques for academic publishing. Ma'am, now floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Padma. Thank you for this warm introduction and welcome. And before I start, I would just like to say that I'll be sharing some nuggets with everybody. Am I audible? I hope.
Yes, madam. You're audible.
I'll be sharing some nuggets with everybody on effective writing for academic publishing. Some of these are theoretical aspects and some of these are practical aspects that I've gained from my experiences in publishing journal articles and books. So I'll share my screen with everybody. One second. Yes. So when we start speaking about writing, we understand that writing is both a product and a process. It's a process in the sense that we need to understand that there are certain steps to writing. There is some kind of preparation that we have to do as writers. And in terms of whether we want to speak something or we want to write something. It's also a process in terms of how we are going to write and what we are going to write. And the different ways in which we can publish, the different modes of publishing. It's a product in terms of the fact that once the writing is complete, the writing piece becomes part of an established body of work or research, either in the form of a journal article or in the form of a book, or maybe in the form of edited chapters in a volume. We can broadly divide writing in terms of pre-writing skills, the actual writing process, and post-writing. Post-writing is something which I'm going to discuss a little later in terms of publications or publishing. So we would start with pre-writing skills. Here, I am not going to focus on classroom activities, but I'm actually going to focus on those skills or those techniques that can help anybody to become a more effective writer or more effective academic writer, so to say. So the first part is, most of us when we write, we tend to experience something which is called a writer's block. That is, sometimes we do not have too many ideas to write on. And obviously in our educational setup, we understand that academic writing is of great value, not just for our promotions, for our career, but also for our intellectual growth. So one way in which we can do away with writer's block is through both intensive and extensive reading. Now, extensive reading means we look through a lot of material. Intensive reading is we focus on just one particular topic or subject at hand. And we can do this in two ways. Either we can scan a lot of material or we can skim through it. One of the things that I've learned that helps in academic writing is, often when I experience writer's block, I tend to go to Google Scholar or the websites, the journal websites that my university is subscribed to. And I tend to use keywords to find a topic area. And I download several articles. And then either I can do intensive reading, like I can go through each article in a lot of detail, or I will go through the abstract, the main points, the argument in the article, and the conclusion, which is scanning, going through it very fast. It depends on what our aim is. It depends on what our topic is. Another thing that helps in writing is a kind of reflective engagement with concepts. This means that we need to take time to absorb ideas. We will only be valued as academic writers if we publish something good, something which has some kind of value to the academia. We will not be valued as writers if we keep publishing 4, 5, 6, 20 articles in a row, where the substance of the article is not there. So we need to, once we read, we need to reflectively engage with the ideas. And this is something which I often call as a gestation period. Like, gestation periods, when children are born, they take 9 months as gestation period to grow in the mother's womb. Similarly, when we read, we should allow our ideas to grow, develop, think more about them, think of interrelationships. Which brings me to the next point, which is mind mapping and association building. Both these techniques are very important in developing interrelationships. For example, let's say we want to write something on gender, okay? Or we want to write something about our ESL writing, something about students. So we need to think of what topic we're writing on. We can probably read 1 or 2 articles, 3 articles. And after that, we need to think, how can we frame our argument? How can we contribute? How will we collect our data? Are there any existing studies available on this topic? How am I bridging the gap? So all this is a part of association building and mind mapping. Though association building and mind mapping are also skills which help us in developing our academic vocabulary, a point that I'm going to discuss a little later. Another technique that helps in free writing is something which is called free writing. Free writing just means, let's say I have some random ideas and I jot them down and I start writing those ideas, whatever is coming to my mind. And then I pick up on the basis of what I've written, I develop a argument, going through it again, and then I pick out certain keywords from those, and then I write on those. So what I'm actually doing is, I am refining my writing from general to more specific, till I actually have a concrete idea in mind, a concrete concept in mind. This is what I want to write about. But one of the disadvantages of free writing is it takes a little more time. So my suggestion would be mind mapping and association building are a little faster and they're a little more helpful. The last aid to pre-writing is something which is known as clustering and interdisciplinary work. Now, clustering is, suppose again, I want to work on ESL. What do I want to work on ESL? Do I want to work on students' responses? then what kinds of responses? So I will have a mental map in my mind where I will have ESL, then I will have students responses, then I will have what kinds of responses: interview responses, questionnaire responses, or survey responses. What kinds of questions am I going to put in it? How am I going to collect my data? And for example, what are the arguments or conclusions that I'm drawing from it? This becomes a sort of a cluster. In this cluster, for every research that we do, we need to look at interdisciplinary relationships. That is, we will not find everything pertaining to what we want to write in our subject area. We will find things pertaining to what we want to write in different areas. So if I want to write an ESL, maybe I should look at a related topic, let's say like writing or listening, or I can even look at a topic like diversity in the classroom, a slightly different topic. Maybe I find my responses there. So this is interdisciplinary work. A little further, maybe I can look at research in educational psychology to understand how my ESL writing can be connected to students and their psychology. So this is, all these activities help us to create a sort of platform to begin writing. Then after this, we have this kind of a structure for writing. A lot of people in academic writing say that writing is a top-down pyramid where we move from general to specific. But actually, we don't move from general to specific or specific to general. We move from specific details to expanding those details. And this is the way I can explain. For example, the most important thing in writing is focusing and developing a topic sentence. A topic sentence means I have a topic in mind and I want to develop the idea for it. On the basis of that, I will create an argument, and that becomes the main standpoint of my entire paper or article or book or whatever. Now, normally a topic sentence will not deal with more than 4 issues. We cannot have a clustered, a congested topic sentence. So one example that I've given is, if you can see the example, video games are not good for children's health and they cause overexposure and psychological issues. Here we are talking about video games, we're talking about children's health, we are talking about the process of overexposure, and we're talking about psychological issues. Now, children's health and psychological issues are similar. They're not same, they're not identical, but they're similar. So a better way of framing this would be, overexposure to video games is detrimental to the psychological health of children. And we state the age group. Psychological health of children in the age group of maybe 10 to 15 years of age. So this becomes much more specific. Like I've said, in our topic sentence, we need to be very, very specific and not deal with more than 3 or 4 issues. We need to be coherent in the sense, again going back to that example, we need to be coherent in the sense that we have to create a sequence in our ideas. We cannot have disjointed ideas. I cannot talk about children's health in the first part and then psychological issues in the second part. That will not make sense. So I need to put all my information related to a topic at one point. So that is why we need to be coherent. And we need to use academic language. Academic language means there are certain kinds of vocabulary items that are specific to the academia. We use those vocabulary items to sound academic, to sound scholarly. And those vocabulary items will in a way ensure that wherever you send your articles or you send your book proposals or your chapters, there are higher chances that it's going to be accepted. Needless to say, brevity becomes a very important point. We need to be brief in writing our topic sentences. Now, where do these topic sentences occur? These topic sentences occur usually at the end of an introduction. If you've seen a journal article, either we can begin with a topic sentence, the first line itself, but the usual trend is normally at the end of the first paragraph, we will have the topic sentence. So we might typically in a journal article or in a chapter, in the first and the second paragraph, we will talk about the topic in a little general manner, that this is what we're trying to say. Let's say ESL writing, coming back to that example. We are talking about ESL writing, writing for learners of a particular age. So this is writing, this is how it's relevant, etc., etc. And then from there, after those 2-3 sentences, we come to our main topic sentence, that this is what our claim is, this is what we're trying to say. But topic sentences, this is not the case that they only occur at the end of the introduction. In fact, in our schools and colleges, we've all learned that a typical essay in school has an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. Similarly, for academic writing, we will have an introduction, a very robust body, and concluding remarks. Now, the body of your work, whatever you're writing, each paragraph will include a topic sentence that you're going to substantiate with reasons or evidence or examples or whatever. So topic sentences do not just occur in our introduction, what the main idea, what we're trying to say, but they are also main ideas for every paragraph. And we should write in such a way that we develop our topic sentences. In fact, this is one of the things that I teach my students when I'm doing academic writing with them, that once we know how to develop a topic sentence, we'll be able to write very smoothly, very fluently. Then another aid to writing, or another technique, is what I talked about just a few minutes back, academic vocabulary. One very important academic vocabulary list, you can say, is something which is called AWL, right? Academic vocabulary list. That is what it is called. And this is freely available on the internet. Anywhere you can type AWL, you will find this list. It's been created by Australian researchers working in the field of writing, academic writing. And in this list, we actually get to know different words or synonyms or even antonyms for a concept or notion that we want to talk about. For example, there are two very common words that are used in qualitative research or research which is analytical: construction and representation. Now, many scholars might tend to use these words as synonyms, but they're actually not synonyms. Construction means any approach in writing that we are using which constructs a particular image. And so through our writing, we show that this image is being constructed. Once that image is constructed, we have a representation. So construction comes a little before, representation comes a little later. So only when we're familiar with academic vocabulary will we know the subtle differences between words and how they can be used. Another very important technique for writing is, this is related to coherence or grammar or stylistic changes, the use of connectives. Many a times, these are some of the common connectives that I've listed here. Connectives related to addition or contrast or cause or effect. But the use of these connectives makes our writing smooth. It makes it easy. It does not seem disjointed. Because let's suppose in 1 or 2 paragraphs, we are talking about points for a particular argument. But we also want to talk about points against it. So it will be nice if we can use connectives that are related to contrast in the 3rd paragraph or the 4th paragraph. So that is why connectives lend a kind of global understanding or global coherence to our writing. Another thing that we should be aware of when we're writing is, we should not use polar words. Polar words are words that show a kind of sweeping generalization. Like we cannot use words like never will this happen, or this always happens in this country, or everyone does this, or nobody does this. We cannot use words like this. Also, we should not use emotional language. Emotional language means emotionally laden adjectives. Words like good, pretty, beautiful, any kinds of words like this, words where we get an impression of something, are not part of academic vocabulary. If we want to say that something is beautiful or something is good, we need to actually prove that in academic writing, that this is the case. Another thing that we should do, this is something that we should not do. Now, what is it that we should do? we should engage in something which is called hedging. Hedging means the use of some particular words that tones down the force of an utterance. So an example that I've given here is children suffer from polio in India. This is a generalization that has no data attached to it. A better way would be to say some children suffer from polio in India. Why? Because obviously we know that many children in India do not suffer from polio, but there can be some cases. And then in the brackets, we should cite the source. Where have we got this information from to make it sound more authentic? So using words like some, generally, most, sometimes, usually, these are words that are hedgers. And hedging helps us to make our claims, to say what we want to say, but in a more polite, toned down manner. The next is, once we have developed a sort of coherence in writing, how to develop our topic sentences, how to substantiate the topic sentences and develop our paragraphs, what kind of words we use, what kind of words we do not use. We then go on to something which is called factuality in writing. Factuality means that our writing will only be considered scholarly and academic enough if we use the following kinds of data or the following kinds of sources. The first is statistical data. We should refrain from talking about things for which we do not have statistical evidence. We should also use authoritative sources in making our claims. One very simple example which I find for authoritative sources is, often in books on academic writing, we'll come across things like primary sources and secondary sources, right? So primary sources will be main writers who've written on a topic. Secondary sources will be other people who've written on it. But since this is the digital age, and let's say because of COVID, all our teaching and learning has become online. So one way of finding authoritative sources online is by this simple technique. We should always use search engines like Google Scholar, Academia, Project Muse for our citations. We should always look at websites like .org for our citations, not Wikipedia, not blogs, not opinion-based articles, general articles, not those. So the latter is not authoritative, the former is authoritative. And obviously journal articles. They can be open access articles, they can be print publications. The other is the use of historical or archival data or official and government records. If we can find something like this on the internet, we can find official websites where some data is cited, then obviously there's nothing like it. That would make our writing much more authentic. Now, after this, we can talk about the types of writing, because we have basically 3-4 basic kinds of writings. One is where we are making arguments or giving our opinions, but in a very scholarly manner. The second is where we are talking about cause and effect, right? More popular, let's say, in the life sciences or the physical sciences. Something more popular in the social sciences is descriptive articles, informative articles, or argumentative articles, articles that have a clear argument. Based on these kinds of articles or these writings, we will actually have 4 kinds of styles, 4 things that we can do in our writing. What should we do? First, we should be able to make claims in our writing. We should be able to claim that this is the case. If I'm building an argument, I should be able to claim. So claims becomes an important part of arguments or descriptive articles, right? I should be able to justify a point, part of descriptive, informative type. Somebody has said something, or I am using that person's citation, using those person's ideas by properly citing their name. I should be able to justify that this is why I'm doing so. I should also be able to make a counterclaim. Many of us in India, We are taught how to get good grades. We are taught how to become intelligent students, but we are not taught how to make counterclaims. Counterclaims means challenging what the authorities have written. And challenging what the authorities have written does not mean that we are being negative or biased against them. It means that we take some of their ideas, but critique some of their ideas. That is, we take some, but we challenge or critique some other ideas. And that helps us to make or create our argument and our claims. This is something which is extensively taught in Western universities, but it is not often taught in our Indian universities. And this is something which is very important, because if we want to write something which is original, something that a lot of people have not written about, we should not only be in a position to accept and support the ideas of leading scholars, but also to critique them and to develop our viewpoint. And lastly, it is the practice of citing evidence. Citing evidence can be cited from any of these four in ways that I've mentioned above, either through statistics or through journal articles, books, authoritative sources, historical sources, or government data. Apart from this, in writing, we also need to be very careful about the way we cite and what we quote. Often, quotations are used by academic scholars to increase the number of pages or to add volume to our writing. But actually, quotations should be used in two ways, and they're two very effective ways. One, they are to be explained and expanded upon if we are writing something descriptive or interpretative. So we write a quotation and then we explain what it means and what we think it means. That is one. And the second way is we should use quotations to reinforce our argument. We want to say something and somebody has mentioned 4 words or 5 words that we feel are very effective, not the whole sentence. We should put those 4 or 5 words within double inverted commas and cite that person properly. The author, the page number, the year, everything, right? One of the most effective websites that I have found for quotations and citations is Purdue OWL. OWL means OWL, Online Writing Lab. And Purdue OWL is obviously managed by Purdue University in America. And there is not only information given on different reference styles like MLA or APA, but even on punctuation, even on grammar, syntax, vocabulary. So it's a very good website for our use, for our personal use, and also for teaching writing to our students. Another thing that I've learned from experience in quotations and citations is we should not begin our journal articles with quotation marks, but we can always begin a book with quotation marks. Journal articles are supposed to be more concise and brief. So it's better to begin to the point with research or with our topic sentence. But books are more comprehensive. They're more lengthy. So we can take more space to develop our ideas, so we can quote there. And another point that helps in writing is how we develop our review of literature. Many a times we have a very good idea. We also have some means of data collection, how we collect, how we're going to interpret. But we need to develop a review, a body of existing studies on that work to prove that this is what has been done and this is how we are building on it. So one of the basic things that a review does, it obviously shows that we as writers are very, very scholarly and very, very to the point, very precise. So the first thing that it does is it helps to bridge ideas. It helps to bridge the gap. There are 6-7 studies done on a topic, but you want to do something which is slightly different. So it's always good to write about those 6-7 studies, one after the other. Okay. Or maybe in terms of a theme, that this is a theme I've chosen to write on. These are what are the studies on this theme. And then you say that this has not been done. This is what I'm planning to do. And that is why my work becomes relevant. Another reason why the review is used is to just develop existing ideas. There are some articles written by established writers, thinkers, or theorists where they will give an extensive review of a particular area, what all has been done in that area, and they will critique the works that have been done in that area. So this comes a little later, right? The first thing is we should use a review to bridge our ideas. The second is where we give a review and critique the works or writings that have been done in a particular area. So that is, and through that critique, we develop our argument that X has been done, Y has been done, Z has been done, but this is something that has not been done and should be done in research. So the researchers actually not showing or talking about their analysis or their research, but they're developing a review article. So that's the second thing. And the third most important is when we develop a review of literature, we should remember that all the works or writings related to my topic will not be found within one area, one small narrow area. They will be found in different areas. So for example, if I want to work on students and emotions, how is it that emotions can be understood in terms of student psychology, and how it's going to help our Indian students in maybe in the secondary school level? I will obviously look at articles in education, articles related to student psychology, but I should also look at a very different area, articles related to emotions in pure psychology, or articles related to emotions in discourse analysis or culture studies, a totally different area. Why? Because that will help us to develop our argument. It will also give us ideas on what to write and what not to write. What is the trend? What is being done? How can I write? How do I want to be different? Or do I want to support these ideas? So interdisciplinarity becomes a very important point in developing a review of literature. And developing a review obviously becomes a very important point in writing effectively when we want to publish academic work. Now, these are some of my observations, some practical observations on writing and methodology. Once we've developed some of our techniques of writing, I am now going to move on to writing and methodology, and then I would move on to publishing per se. So the first observation, something that I found is often scholars or writers tend to have a lot of confusion when it comes to the use of questionnaire and interviews. And what kinds of questions should be used in it? Open-ended questions, closed class items, what kind of questions? Normally, there are a few things that become very important, practical suggestions. When we're using questionnaires, our questionnaires should be short. They should be in simple language and they should be brief. Because when you're developing a questionnaire, think in terms of being the respondent. Would you like to answer a long questionnaire? No. So why would somebody else like to answer a long questionnaire? So the questionnaire should be brief and precise. But in some cases, we cannot use a questionnaire because the questionnaire will give us closed class items. It will give us close-ended questionnaire answers. Yes, no kind of questions, or questions based on a rating scale, like good, very good, not at all good, things like that, right? So we are not getting in-depth information. So sometimes we should use interviews. Interviews again can be either we can have a formal interview structure where we have a set of questions that are pre-prepared and we ask everybody the same questions without any change, or they can be semi-structured, some kind of flexibility depending on who's talking what. We find something a little more interesting, we go a little more into that topic. Interview questions again should be fewer in number. They can be more also, that is not an issue, but the language should be very simple and they have to be open-ended. Like, can you tell me something about this? What do you think about this? What do you feel about this? We should allow people to speak. So that is what we mean by open-ended. Also, in some kinds of research, especially in research related to writing, where most of our research is based on students and collection of data from them, right? We need to use consent forms. Consent forms means we need to tell the students, ask them to sign a form where they state that they do not have any objection in allowing their material or their response to be used for academic purposes, maybe in a journal article or in a book. So the language of the consent form also needs to be very, very simple. And it needs to be brief, not very long. But this again becomes an issue. Why? Because in some subject areas, the language of the consent form is very, very extensive. And there is a lot that is written. But in some other areas, it is brief. So for example, if I am conducting a kind of medical research, then the consent form is going to be very long, because the person needs to know what all can happen and how will the data be collected, what is the purpose of the data collection, where is it going to be, etc., etc. But broadly in the social sciences, for example, if you're collecting data in English or in history or in psychology or political science or sociology, any other area, we can have a brief consent form where we talk about the main purpose of our work and whether the person gives consent for it or not, obviously stating the most important, that the information and the person's identity will be kept confidential. Another aspect in writing, which actually goes hand in hand with writing, the actual process of writing, is reflexivity. Reflexivity means we are continuously reflecting on what we're doing. We should be aware of why we're doing something. Why are we doing some kind of research? What is the reason for it? And obviously, we should avoid some kind of researcher bias. Like, I want a particular kind of conclusion. That kind of thinking will not work in academic writing. You might want a particular kind of conclusion, but the conclusion or the results might be totally different. So you should go with the flow. Whatever results you get, you should focus on those results, right? That is what we talk about reflexivity, always looking back at our process. The next point is, sometimes writers, once they get a little published, right, in articles or in books, they tend to recycle the same information to write new articles. Now, this is something that has been dealt very strongly by the UGC. We should check out the UGC guidelines on this, where they say, they use the term self-plagiarism, that writing our own material in a different language does not tantamount to writing new work. So we should recycle with caution, right? It is always better to write less, but write on different topics instead of recycling the same work. Another one is the use of intertextuality. Intertextuality means a text refers back to texts that were written before and texts that are written in contemporary times. So, for example, this image that I've put of the Mona Lisa, right? Mona Lisa is a very famous painting. But there are many versions of the painting that have been done. This particular version is a popular art version of the painting. So we should be always be ready as researchers to look at intertextual links in our work. Can we, if we are focusing on some students in writing for our research, can we look at some other kinds of data and also comment on that? Can we talk about some show or some book or some article that was already written on it? Can we engage with that? Things that are written or produced contemporary times. So that means looking at intertextually, looking at our work and the works of others. And obviously, needless to say, once we've written something, first we should not plagiarize. Plagiarism even means, according to MLA and APA, it even means copying 3 words in a row from something is plagiarism. So we should not do that, obviously. But in case we have a doubt that something has been plagiarized, we should use softwares like Turnitin and Urkunt for establishing the factuality of our work. Then Here are some of the digital writing resources that I found that can be useful for most of you. Some of them, the initial ones are based on English writing, learning and teaching and understanding writing vocabulary, syntax, grammar, right? There's one by Cambridge. There is another one by My English Pages. There is a very good one by California Distance Learning Project. But the latter ones, like the ones by University of Pittsburgh or Massachusetts, okay, or open educational resources in California, all these are websites where we are not just focusing on English, we are focusing on other subject areas. So these, because English is not is one of the subject areas. We will also have writers writing in other areas in the social sciences and life sciences. So these are some of the other websites where not only can we look at resources that can become a part of our review of literature in our writings, but these resources can also be adapted by us, because most of them are open resources. They can be adapted by us for our online teaching and learning in our different subject areas. Then I am now going to move on to talking about academic articles and books to deal specifically with the idea of academic publishing. So one of the basic things that we should remember when we're writing journal articles is readers are writers. So we should publish in those journals that we read. We should not publish in journals that we do not read. Because when we publish in journals that we read, we are abreast with information. We know what's happening, what's being written in that journal. We know what is the latest information. And we also know the kinds of articles, the styles of writing that are accepted in that journal. Then, after, let's say, tier 1 journals, UGC obviously has different tiers. But after tier 1 journals, maybe for the first 5 or 10, the impact factor doesn't become so important, though it is important, but not highly important. And we have print publications, but we also have open access. That is DOAJ, Directory of Open Access Journals. And some of these journals from DOAJ are part of our UGC care list. While we're looking at that, we should also be aware of predatory journals. Predatory journals are journals that ask us for a publication fees in publishing, right? And a good way of understanding this is looking at obviously UGC's list, because they've now recently, a few weeks back, uploaded a list on fake or cloned journals. But there's also this American researcher called Jeffrey Beal. His list, journal list, is also available on the internet. And he gives you it's a very comprehensive yet concise list of those journals that are predatory. So we should not try to publish articles there. Another way of understanding, whether a journal is of value before we send an article to that journal is to look at the metrics. So we have Google Scholar, we have CS Margo, we have Microsoft Academic Journal Analytics, different kinds, which will tell us about the influence of that journal, the impact factor in the past 5 years, how many citations have happened, how popular is the journal, what's the viewership, and things like that. Now we can come to a slightly lengthy way of publishing, which is not publishing in journals, but publishing books. And here, obviously, we have two ways. We can publish online, which is digital publishing, but we can also publish through the traditional route. Now, the traditional route is obviously a little more prestigious. It has more value. Like the books that were mentioned by Dr. Padma, my works, they have been published in Routledge, right? So that's an international publisher, and that's a traditional publisher. So publishing houses like Routledge, Cambridge, Sage, Oxford are international publishers. And if we are sending a book proposal, we should always try to send it to these publishers first, or some very good reputed local national level publishers in our area. Normally the process of publishing involves sending a book proposal, and that'll take about about a month or 2 months for the review to happen, for the acceptance and for the commissioning. And there is a 2-time blind review process. First, not only is the book proposal reviewed, but also when we submit a manuscript to these prestigious publishing houses, the entire manuscript is also reviewed. And so we have a 2-time blind review process. And in both the cases, the reviews are extensive. We are told what are the problems, how can we deal with the problems, and things like that. One very good reason for publishing with these publishing houses is they not only have a very good digital and print market, but they also have easy access and they are more popularly or well known. But this said, we can also publish in the digital formats. Either ways, whatever we try to publish in, we should decide on the basis of what our topic is, how long we want our work to be. For example, in traditional print publications, books can be of two types. Either they can be a 200-page monograph, or they can be a 150-page, 120-page introductory book, right? And obviously on the basis of our target audience. Sometimes it's good to publish in 2 languages at the same time. So producing or writing a bilingual book in 2 languages, let's say Hindi and English, or Marathi and English, or Telugu and English, something like this, which would increase the readership in the market. And before we publish either books or journals, we should be aware of the competition that is available in the market. This is especially so for books, more so for books. Why? Because anybody can turn around and say that this has already been done. So how is your work different? In fact, my suggestion would be when we are writing books, we should publish in those areas that have not been explored in a lot of detail, which makes our work a relevant contribution to that area. The last thing that I want to mention is something which is known as being a stakeholder. We should, after all the techniques and all the bits on the data collection and the writing journals and writing books, we need to remember in a very important way a concept that I use from these 2 researchers called Holloway and Jefferson. And this concept is called affective investment. And this concept was actually used by them in their research on crime. And it largely means a simple thing. We should write on those topics where we are interested in. We should write on topics that we have a lot of conviction about, something that we believe in very, very strongly. So these are some of the questions that we can look at. Obviously, what is our interest? Can that topic be and that interest be sustained? Can we actually write a 20-page article on it? Or can we write a 150-page book on it? Can we do that? What is the feasibility of the topic? We might have a brilliant topic, but if we can't collect data on it, or if we can't find written texts to analyze, then there is no point in venturing in that direction. What are the chances of my research, my work being accepted? How can I change my work according to this? Becomes a very important question when we are sending our work to journals, because sending our work to journals is not an easy process. If we send it to poor quality journals, obviously the work will be easily accepted, but we are also known by the kind of work we publish and who we publish with. If we send it to good publishing houses or good journals, right, they will take time. They will take 6 to 8 months to maybe a year also to publish, which is fine. We should not lose hope. But before sending it, we should do our review of literature. We should ensure the academic language that we've used, written it properly, so that there are more chances of our work being accepted. And what have others contributed to that area? Can my work stand apart from other people's contributions? Then there is a very high chance of my work being accepted. And obviously, what are the answers to possible questions about the topic? We come back to this question and we go back to something which I discussed earlier, which is called reflexivity. Reflexivity again means going to and fro, always being aware of what we're doing. We are writing, but we're developing our questions. We've developed our questions and we are writing. So there's a constant movement from theory to practice, from data to interpretation, from actual data collection to writing. This is something that we should practice regularly if we want to become good academic writers. In the end, I'd just like to say that as academicians, all of us are academicians here, we should never lose hope when we're writing. We can start off with writing in simple ways. We can start off with writing with humble beginnings. I also started off by publishing my work in Indian journals because the area in which I work, discourse analysis, there are not too many journals available in India. And gradually from there, once my articles were accepted, I got the confidence to approach big publishing houses and to send my work to more scholarly journals. So it is always a process and it always takes time. So we should have the patience and we should not lose hope. Thank you. Are there any questions related to the topic?
Yes, madam. And it's a very nice presentation, madam. Many of our participants texted that your session is excellent, very informative, inspiring, nice presentation. Now, I have a question.
Yes.
From a participant. Let me ask. S. Prasad asks you, how can we find out what kind of language author used in different essays through different essays?
Ma'am, could you please repeat the question?
How can we find out what kind of language author used in different essays?
How can we find out? Okay. So one very easy way of finding out is we should, once we have one topic in mind or one particular theme in mind, that this is what I want to work on, right? I should I should obviously collect data, 2-3 articles on that topic in that area. Let's say, again, I'll give you the example of writing. I can collect 2-3 articles on writing, just academic writing, but I should also collect 2-3 articles from different areas, maybe techniques of writing, or writing and political speech, or writing and history, something totally not related to that topic, yet related. And once I look at all those articles, skim through them, if I have the time, I can read through them, but I can skim through them. I'll understand that these are subtle differences in the language that is used. Also, I should be able to consult the academic word list.
Thank you, madam. We have another question too. Yes. And the question is, would you suggest some plagiarism check softwares?
Yes, there is Turnitin and there is Urkund. These are the more reliable softwares, I would say. Out of these two, these are actually the most reliable. Out of these two, Turnitin is much more rigorous as compared to Urkund. Some of the free softwares are small tools, or plagiarism checker, X. These are some of the free tools that are available. But the problem with the free plagiarism software is only some amount of our text can be checked. Whereas with Turnitin and Urkund, at one go, 200 pages, 250 pages can be checked. So that's the thing.
Okay, ma'am, thank you. We have another question from Sampurna Guha. Madam, are online publications better? Sorry, are online or e-publications better compared to hard copy publishing in today's times?
I would say no, because even though online publications have become very popular, and some of our print publications are also available online, like some of the major international publishing houses that I mentioned, when they publish your work, they will publish your work not just in the print form, but also as a soft copy in the digital form. So that is available. Some of the journal articles, journals also publish both in print and e-format. But print publication cannot be replaced as of now. So print publications are a little better. So we should first try for print publications. But yes, one point, if in the UGC CARE list, there is one that I know of in my area. It's not really my area, but broadly in linguistics. It is a journal which is called Language at Internet. And this is just an online publication. There is no print copy available. And this has a very high metrics on, if I check on Google Scholar or say Smago, if I check on that. So if you find a journal like that, then obviously it's very valuable. But mostly print publications are more prestigious.
Thank you, madam. I request Zoom participants to raise their hands to ask questions. Dr. Soumya is waiting. Any more questions from the participants?
Ma'am, there are some questions that are there in the chat.
Okay, please carry on, madam.
Yes, there is one that that has been asked by Madam Suvarna Ragini, which says, what is the difference between paid and unpaid journals in terms of their reputation? The major difference is this. As a scholar, if we are all working on journal articles, we know the kind of time, energy, effort that we've put into writing it. Now, if I send it to a paid publication, the value of the article will come down drastically. Why? Because everybody would know, oh, I've given money for this publication. But if I send it to a journal where that there is no publication fees, then even though the paid and the unpaid both will have a very strong review process. This is done in a lot of American journals where they ask for publication fees. They will both types will have a very strong review process. But somehow my article's value will be totally lowered. It will not make any sense. So it's always better to send it to a journal that is not paid. Even if it is not international, it is Indian, but it will still be valued.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
AR Vijay.
Yes.
There is one more question. Please suggest good publishers related to science-related subjects.
Good publishers. One of the best ways of finding this is obviously your Web of Science Index. The Web of Science Index that's become a part of UGC mostly has science publications. Mostly has science. In fact, when I was searching for sending my work to a journal, I have found most of them were science. So if you go to the UGC website, you can create a login, username, password on the website, log in, and you can look at Web of Science. Web of Science has very good, very standard publications when it comes to science. Unfortunately, many of our Indian journals in science, life sciences, are not accepted, which is also the case with our social sciences. Some of our very good journals in social sciences are not accepted in UGC CARE.
Any more questions, participants? Please raise your hand, Zoom participants. Madam will answer your questions. I think there are no questions, madam.
Here we have a question.
Okay.
From Niaz.
Okay.
I am unmuting you. Please, you can ask your question. Niaz, I have unmuted you. You can speak now. Okay, madam, we can leave it. They may have got some technical issues.
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay. Shafi sir, did you share the link, sir, feedback link? Okay, ma'am. I think there are no questions.
Yes.
Shall I
Alright.
proceed, madam? Shall I proceed?
Yes.
Soumya, ma'am.
Yes, yes, sure.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your vibrant session and vibrant presentation.
Thank you.
Now, there is an announcement to all the participants. Attendance and feedback link will be shared on Zoom, YouTube, Telegram, and WhatsApp. Please fill the form and submit. The link will be open for 1 hour. And it's time for... Yes, madam.
Asked by somebody. If I could answer that, if that's possible. In the chat, the question has been mentioned.
Okay, ma'am. Carry on, ma'am.
Yes, there was a question that's asked which says if I can talk about some online publications for language. So in language or in linguistics, some of the publications are, obviously we have, some of our Indian publications are Indian linguistics managed by LSI, Linguistic Society of India. And apart from this, like I mentioned, there's language at the internet. And then we have publications that are managed by linguistic journals by Oxford and Cambridge, John Benjamin's Press, and some journals like Journal of Language Studies or Journal of Language and Literature, and things like that, or even Discourse Studies. Some of these journals are present. Thank you. Thank you.
Are there any more questions, ma'am?
No, ma'am. No, ma'am. This is the last one that I found.
Okay, ma'am. Shall I proceed?
Yes, surely, ma'am. Surely. Thank you, ma'am.
Wind up?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. And it's time for vote of thanks. At first, I thank our today's speaker, Dr. Soumya Sharma, for grabbing attention of all the participants with her vibrant session. I thank management of VJIT for facilitating us to organize an online faculty development program. My sincere thanks to our HOD, Professor Rajendra Prasad, for his continuous support in organizing online FDP. Next, my hearty thanks to our leading lady, Dr. Indira Priyadarshini ma'am, for her tireless efforts to run this program successfully. I thank all the participants for spending their quality time with us. I thank our technical team, Mr. Shafullah, Mr. Surender, Dr. Sushil Kumar, for their meticulous efforts in conducting this online FDP successfully. Last but not least, I thank our English team of VJIT for their determination and commitment in organizing such an excellent faculty development program. Thank you. Stay home, stay safe. Namaste.